We're going to start this course by talking about the migration patterns of the people who become known as the Native Americans. And the first major group we're going to kind of segue into will be the Andean Civilizations along the western coastline of South America. So I usually like to start the slides with what I call an outline slide, which gives you a title at the top and a general kind of date range of the areas that we're or the times that we're going to be talking about, places we're going to be talking about, and then a breakdown below that gives the usually 4 or 5 major different kind of subtopics within each lecture. So you'll see those subtopic titles will pop up at the top of the slides with these numbers, so you get a feel for where we are in the lecture as we're going through it. All right, so first kind of subtopic is this prehistory idea of where people came from in general and how old they are, and we'll try to skip past those million years or so as quickly as we can and get into the Andean civilizations. So humans are actually a very new development when you think about the Earth's overall age. Most scientists estimate that the Earth is somewhere around 4.5 billion years old with a B, which is an astronomical amount of time for any of us to really contemplate. A lot of us have a hard time even thinking about a century, just 100 years. So by looking at this chart on this slide, we'll see that the first kind of oxygen atmosphere we don't even get until 2 billion years ago, so over halfway through the Earth's natural history. And the first celled organisms that we know of with the nucleus pop up somewhere around 1.75 billion years ago. And as you go further and further along, you'll see kind of dinosaurs are way down there at somewhere around 65 million years ago. So comparatively, humans are very new in Earth's history. They've only been around in the form that we recognize them today for 1 million or 2 million years before year zero. And that's another thing we should mention, this BCE you see at the bottom. BCE stands for Before Common Era. It's a kind of modern scientific measurement of years before zero. So it's very similar to what you've probably heard of before, which is BC. So a lot of our culture talks about, say, 100 BC is 100 years before zero, and that the years after zero are AD. So say the year 2000 AD is the year 2000 after zero. Scientists and historians try to get away from the BC and AD definition of years, mostly because they're so heavily connected to certain religious movements. And historians and scientists say they want to be more objective, and so they've come up with this BCE definition, which means Before Common Era. It's the same measure of years before zero. They just say BCE instead of BC, and they say CE, Common Era, instead of AD. But again, it's the same measure of numbers of years after year zero. So the year 2000 AD would be called 2000 CE. It's the same year. It's just, again, the historians and scientists and archaeologists and whatnot, they just try to use a more kind of objective, non-religious definition. So 10,000 BCE is 10,000 years before zero. We are pretty certain that humans in the form that we recognize them today existed at least 1 million years before zero, and that what we call the Paleolithic Age, which means the kind of old stone tool age, lasts from about 1 million BCE to about 10,000 BCE. So what is the Paleolithic Age? This is a pretty good image I like to use for the Paleolithic Age. It's mostly what we would think of as kind of caveman-like lifestyles and caveman-like humans. So number one, humans mostly survive by using pretty primitive tools, usually stone tools. So that's where we get the Paleolithic term from. Most humans survive by finding food as hunters or gatherers, and kind of human tribes would usually break down between male and female, and the males would go out and hunt game animals, herds, to gather food, and the females would gather food from trees and bushes and whatnot, or any kind of plants that had berries or something that would be growing kind of naturally in the environment that they were already at. And if they exhausted the food supply of their local area where they are, they would just pick up and move to a new area. So they did not produce their own food. They just kind of lived off of what was naturally occurring around them. And when that food supply is exhausted, they pick up and go somewhere else. So these are kind of wandering groups of people that are barely surviving. There's no long-term settlement. There's no kind of housing, permanent housing of any kind. There's no long-term planning. It's really just use what's around you until it's gone and then go to another place. So these kinds of earliest humans are inherently unstable. They move around a lot. They have to follow the food supply. They're very vulnerable to changes in weather patterns or the seasons. So the two biggest accomplishments of the whole Paleolithic era, which is an astronomical amount of time, nearly 1,000,000 years, is that they learned to control fire, and that they start creating, we believe, spoken and also written forms of language. The next era that we start to see becomes known as the Neolithic era. And that starts at around 10,000 BCE, and that's when we start to see changes in human behavior. The first really biggest one is that they start to develop some type of settlement for the long term and some type of control or creation of their own food supply for long-term planning. So they start what we today think of as agriculture. So the Neolithic Age, the Neolithic Revolution, is often also called the agricultural revolution. Basically, humans start making houses for long-term settlement, and they start creating what we would today think of as farms around those settlements to grow certain types of crops in large numbers, to raise and control livestock, farm animals for food or for labor. And so they become the producers of their own food supply rather than just living off the land that naturally occurred around them. We call it the Neolithic Age because they start using more advanced stone tools. That's what Neo basically means, the new tool age. And again, with livestock and crops, that kind of creates the big change in the society. So historians talk about these Neolithic groups starting to try to control nature and the natural environment around them for their own long-term benefit. We have to note that the Neolithic Revolution did not happen in all places and all times at the same time. It seems to have started in a few places and then spread out from there, probably because it was such a good idea for stability of the society. Another major development that we see is the creation of early pottery. We mostly think makes it easier to transport food, to move it around, instead of just gathering it in your hands and walking around having it spilled through your fingers. They would create pottery to put food into these jars or bowls and move it around without spilling. Storing food, again, long-term planning, creating a harvest and storing food for the kind of lean times of the year when the food doesn't grow nearly as much. And cooking food, which we believe made food not just kind of better tasting, but also easier to eat and easier to digest. So that means that the human body didn't have to spend so much energy digesting the food to get the nutrients out of it. Once they cook it, it's easier for the body to digest. All right, so next slide shows generally the first indications of the biggest Neolithic revolutions in the ancient parts of the world. You'll see this slide very often in textbooks, especially World Civ textbooks and Western civilization textbooks. So the biggest early Neolithic revolutions tended to happen we believe first in the Indus Valley, right here in the middle of the map, in what is today northwestern India. And then we believe in Mesopotamia further to the west, and then in China further to the east. We believe that these Neolithic revolutions developed fairly independently of each other, somewhere around the same time, within a couple thousand years or so. And then the idea spread to places like Egypt, and then further north to Greece, and further east to Japan and whatnot. So these are some of the four early major civilizations that a lot of textbooks would talk about. It's a very, very famous type of image for people to study. So how does this impact all the Americas then, if they're pretty far off the map? Most historians and archaeologists believe that what come to be known as the Native Americans traveled from very northeastern Asia, very far north of Japan and China, and that these groups might not have taken part in the Neolithic Revolution yet, and so they were still hunter-gatherer type societies, and that they basically walked from Northeast Asia across these dotted lines way up at the top left of this image, across what is known as the Bering Strait land bridge, and crossed into what is basically thought to be today to be kind of Alaska, and then walked down through modern-day Canada and into the rest of North America and kind of spread out from there. It's important to note that the Bering Strait land bridge was land. It was not just some kind of glacier that got stuck or something like that. It was not all just a big iceberg full of snow that people had to cross. It was exposed land that was above the ocean. We think that this land was exposed for a fairly short period of time, perhaps up to 4,000 years, between 14,000 and 10,000 BCE. There's a lot of theories for why that land was suddenly exposed for just those few thousand years. One of the bigger theories is that a glacier moved into the area and got stuck and trapped a bunch of water off to the side, which exposed the land for a few thousand years. And that this land is only about 1,000 miles wide, so about twice the distance from LA to San Francisco. So not very large given the amounts of land we're talking about with Asia and North America. And that this land, even today, the land is still there. It's just underwater because once the glacier moved out, the water came back out and covered the land. And we believe that area today is still only about 100 feet underwater. So it's just below the water surface. So you can't see it today just with the naked eye, but we have mapping that shows us where it is. And most historians and archaeologists believe that for that few thousand years that land was uncovered and just exposed to the air, that a bunch of people took advantage of that and followed animals across, or game herds, or just a food supply of whatever kind, and made their way over from Asia to Alaska and then down into North America. There's also some archaeological kind of geological evidence that points to the idea that perhaps the Bering Strait land bridge was also exposed between 50 and 40,000 BCE, but we don't have any archaeological evidence of any human remains or contact with that area at that time. So if it was exposed, we don't believe that people walked across it at that point. So most historians stick with the 14,000 to 10,000 BCE timeline. And again, once these people moved into modern-day Alaska, they either walked or maybe took a series of small boat rides down the coastline down into North America, and then spread out from basically from there, from modern-day kind of Washington, Oregon states. There are some kind of divergent opinions. Some genealogists have studied the remains of the people that we believe made that travel, and the early Native American groups that kind of popped up dispersed throughout the Americas. Some some blood work studies, some kind of fossil studies and genealogical studies. So some historians believe that the Native Americans had a much closer genealogical relationship with East Asian islanders. So there are some theories out there that somehow some of the original Native Americans kind of got on boats and went from one island to another throughout the Pacific and eventually made it to North America. But that's a kind of minority opinion amongst historians and archaeologists. Most people stick with the Bering Strait theory. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, and again, here's the Bering Strait theory again, a perhaps better map. 14,000 to 10,000 BCE shows a much better relationship of the exposed land to the kind of grid pattern that is now underwater. And again, most of these historians think that these people were kind of hunter-gatherers looking for food or chasing food, and that they eventually move into the North American continent and would eventually spread into South America and Central America from there. All right, and as they spread out through North America and Central America, they diverged. They kind of moved away from each other. They created different societies, different kind of cultural, tribal groups, different political groups, different confederacies, all kinds of different things, and generally developed over the next several thousand years according to the environment that they existed in. So they worshiped different gods depending on the different environment that they were in. They used different tools depending on the resources that were available in their environment, and developed different cultures depending on their environments. So this is a pretty decent map of the general kinds of different climates that you find in North America today. California, we now believe, was one of the most heavily populated of the very early Native American civilizations. Probably because California has so much really good farmland. There's a lot of microclimates in California that appeal to a lot of different cultures and different kind of personal interests. The most interesting and important society will emerge further south in where's today modern day Mexico. On this map is called Middle America. That becomes known as Mesoamerica, and that's the most important by far because that is where we first start seeing the Neolithic Revolution amongst the Native American populations. This is the first place where they will start developing farming settlements. Small towns with permanent buildings for houses, or at least semi-permanent, and start building farms around those places to control nature and create their own food supply for the long term. And the idea will spread out from there, from Mesoamerica, and will impact many different groups in North and South America. It's hard to nail down exactly when Mesoamerica started its Neolithic or agricultural revolution. Most historians point to somewhere around the year 5000 BCE. Some historians have other evidence that say much later, perhaps 2000 BCE, but generally the idea kind of spreads throughout the Americas by around 500 BCE. And the first major civilizations we'll talk about in any great depth and detail, I want to start with those that pop up along the western coastline of South America in the Andes mountain region. So the textbooks will call them the Andean Civilizations. All right, so one thing to note about the western coastline of South America is that it is extremely difficult to build large populations there because of the Andes Mountains. The Andes are perhaps the biggest mountain range in all of the Americas. They have the highest peaks. They have some of the coldest weather in those mountains, even in their summer times. And it's very difficult to survive because the land is literally uphill. It's a mountainside almost along the whole coastline and down the other side. and that's very difficult for farming because a lot of the mountains are very rocky, so there's a lot of rocks in the soil, which makes farming difficult. And the land just is not flat for farming, so it's hard to get water to it without having all the water run off the side. So it takes a lot of kind of agricultural invention and genius to figure out how to grow enough food to feed a large population on that type of geography. And also because the mountains are so high up, it's very difficult to breathe in those types of elevations. So it's difficult for humans to survive and build large populations in these places and contact each other and move around and whatnot. So the environment is so difficult that we believe that the Native Americans who settled in these areas came up with kind of communal labor ideas where instead of paying taxes in money, would pay taxes to the government in hours or days or even weeks of labor to build the farms or build roads or maintain them to keep the population afloat, basically, to keep people fed and alive. And the first major civilization we'll start to see, this is a good picture of the kind of mountainside type farming attempts that were made. The first major civilizations will start to work within the ecological niches and the kind of microclimates that are famous in the Andean region. Basically, you'll have small different groups trying to figure out how to move supplies and people around up and down these mountains and between these mountains. And the big idea that some of them had was to use the native kind of large pack animal, labor animal of the area, which were llamas. So the llamas were extremely useful for moving around goods because they're big, strong animals. They can move things, if well directed, much faster than humans can. They're much better adapted to the climate, so they have a lot of fur so they can withstand the cold. They have very strong musculatures, which means they can move up and down the mountains much faster, much better. And the cities and civilizations that will learn how to breed and use llamas for labor will basically come to dominate the early Andean civilizations. Shaman civilization will come to be one of the most very early, very important ones. Largely again because they figured out how to use llamas to get goods from the lower elevations up to the higher elevations, and again because the llamas could kind of carry more goods than any kind of individual person, so a pack of well-trained llamas can be very useful. And the Shaman were some of the first to figure this out. So the Shaman you see on this map on the right had a fairly large type of geography that they controlled, that they influenced, mostly through trade relations. Their capital city was Chavannes-de-Montar, and they're around for several hundred years. So their peak of their civilization started around 900 BCE and lasts until about 250 BCE, which is getting very close to year zero. Their society was very stratified, which means there was a ruling group on top, and then there was a kind of probably what we call artisanal class of workers who produced specialized goods like weapons or pens or paper or something like that. And then below there were probably the common farmers who produced the food that society depended on. So stratification means that there are these levels of society, and they are usually fairly separate from each other and try not to allow a lot of intermarriage. So Shaman society was very stratified and ruled from the top down. There were rulers on top who ran the government and made all the big decision, and everyone else below them was ruled probably through a monarchy or dictatorship type situation. The Shaman civilization built massive terraced buildings, as you can see kind of cut into the mountain here on the picture on the left. So they used the natural environment to build their buildings, and it is said that the elite, the most powerful people, lived on the top floor of the building, basically, to show off how much more important they were than everybody else. Another one of Shaban's big cities became known as Mocha, which was further south from the capital city, Shaban down probably around what is present day Lima. So there's two cities that were the dominant ones within the civilization. Two other powerful cities would rise in the Shaban type area. One would become known as Tawana Coup in the highlands, up in the mountains. So Tawana Coup rose on the shore of Lake Titicaca, which is one of the giant lakes of the whole area. It basically was a small town that rose on the side of the lake and became a big city when they figured out how to try to drain some of the low-lying parts of the lake to expose more farmland. So the areas that they exposed, once they drained the water out, were extremely fertile for growing crops because the water was already saturated into the ground. And so that became their Tawanaku's great advantage was super abundant harvest from this land that they had drained the water out of. They also learned how to use llamas to develop very large trade routes, possibly as far south as modern day Chile on the map here, further south of the lake. So that would be an extensive amount of trade and an extensive amount of contact for one city to have. We believe that Tawanaku's society was also very heavily stratified and probably ruled from the top down, like most ancient civilizations were some type of dictatorship of one way or another, either through someone who called themselves the king or the emperor or some type of warlord like that who stayed in power because they had control over an army and often terrorized the population into subservience to the government. Tawana Coup would also build some pretty major and important stone buildings, especially temples. So this is an image of one of them from pretty far away, showing the walls and the kind of terraced steps walking up to the altar, we believe. So this kind of work took a lot of labor and a lot of specialized labor to sand down the stones to make the wall and to fit the stones in. You can see it's perfectly level and it's pretty flattened on the outside. And they would also put these kind of stone cut images, these statues of just heads onto the walls. You can see a lot of them have worn off and been destroyed by now. But they would do that. We don't know exactly why, but they did that in an extremely impressive way to build that into the wall as they were constructing the wall. So you can see this is a massive amount of workmanship and craftsmanship, and extremely well and expensively done. Another one of their towns named Wari broke away from Tawana Cou's control somewhere around, we think, 450 BCE or so, or CE. We think the Wari broke away from Tawana. Let's start this over again. And Tawana Coup society was around for quite a long time. Most historians and archaeologists estimate that Tawana Coup popped up on the shore of the lake and became a dominant power somewhere around 200 years after zero, 200 CE, and would exist for about 800 years. One of their giant cities that grew a little bit further away to the west was called Wari, which eventually broke away. It basically declared independence and became powerful enough to actually achieve independence and break away and start off on their own empire that would rival Tawana Coup. So we think that their independence started somewhere around 450 CE after zero, and would also last, interestingly, right around to 1000 CE. So both Wari and Tawana Coup kind of broke down and disappeared at 1000 CE. We don't know if that is happenstance or if they kind of caused each other's collapse. So at around 1000 CE, both of the major civilizations have gone, and the Shaman civilization was long gone by then. They were gone before year zero. So the next civilization that'll pop up is Incan civilization, and this is the big one that will still be in existence when the Spanish invaders show up in the early 1500s. So the Incas start off really as just one small group around Cusco, we think in the 1200s, and they're just one small local group out of many, many, many different groups around the old Tawana Coup and Wari areas. And they're probably fighting amongst each other, fighting for land and resources and dominance and whatnot. And over a couple hundred years or so, getting into the 1400s CE, it appears that the Incan civilization started to gain the upper hand over its neighbors and its rivals and started to expand very quickly in the early 1400s, especially after the about the year 1430 or so. And their expansion would go on for about 100 years into the early 1500s and would be one of the most impressive major Native American civilizations in history. We believe that the Incan civilization was able to expand and conquer so fast, mostly based on intimidation. So the Incan army would kind of show up to an area that they planned to attack and conquer, and they would actually announce their planned attack to the place that they're planning to attack and the groups that they're planning to try to conquer. And that just the mere announcement of Incan warfare coming to town was so terrifying that the enemies would usually surrender without a fight. So that might be why the conquest grew so quickly, is because the Incan armies didn't actually have to conquer. They just kind of announced that we want to take your area and basically offered a deal. If you surrender without a fight, we won't kill all of you and take all of your land and just make it part of our empire. If you surrender without a fight, then you can keep your land and you can even keep a lot of your political leaders. It's just that they now live under the Incan Empire rather than being their own independent kingdom. So that sounded like a really good deal to a lot of these outlying areas that didn't want to take the risk of having to fight, because if you fight the Incan army and they win, they might massacre the whole population. So they might basically go genocidal against you and destroy your whole civilization. So just giving in and agreeing to a truce, basically, and just living under the Incan rule sounded like a pretty good bargain, especially to the elite landowners who were extremely afraid of losing their land and either being thrown into poverty or being killed. So the Incan civilization, the Incan Empire, expands very, very fast. They probably had to fight a couple of actual wars early on in the 1430s until they came up with this idea of offering basically a peaceful transition. And this peaceful transition became known as Matina. That is the official Incan policy of taking conquered people and really not just allowing them to live in the Incan Empire without being killed, but really assimilating those groups into Incan civilization. So those groups could have an opportunity to become full-fledged Incan citizens. They could still keep their own religions, and the Incan civilization would bring their religious ideas into the Incan kind of religious pantheon of all their gods and their beliefs. So it's very much a kind of cultural assimilation policy that seems to have been such a really good deal for a lot of the conquered people. And there's a lot of stories about how a lot of these conquered peoples are brought into the Incan Empire, and they're really not even discriminated against for being like the new group inside or anything like that, or being culturally different or having a different language or anything like that. So they seem to have the Incans seem to have not just offered equality, but they seem to have actually implemented it after the conquest was completed. So just that kind of threat and the assimilation process were great advantages to the Incan civilization, But probably their biggest advantage that historians have noticed was just the Incan hyper-organization. They're obsessed with organizing their government, their lands, their religious systems. Everything seems to have like this kind of central plan, and the plan is adaptable. If someone can figure out a better way of organizing and running it, especially out in the farmlands, the Incan civilization will take new ideas that work and they'll try to implement it everywhere, to get more crop yields or more resources or more conquest, or whatever the innovation is. So a lot of Incan civilization depends on communication and transportation, because they have this giant empire now that eventually stretches over 3,000 miles long. So this is about the distance from Los Angeles to New York today. It's a very large empire, and it's all basically from the shoreline with the ocean up into the heights of the mountains. So the Inca ruled basically everything that they could, because it's very difficult to cross those mountains and get enough supplies or soldiers on the other side of the mountains to try to control anything on the other side. So the way that they tried to control their empire is through communication and transportation systems, and they build an amazing road network. A lot of these roads were already built by former civilizations that had been around, that either the Incan conquered or those civilizations that just died out, and the Incan just kind of came along and took over what was left infrastructure-wise. But they built up the road system. And you can see the major road system, and the map went north-south and had all these little offshoots that would go into different communities from the main road, all these kind of branch lines. And this massive road system required a lot of maintenance, a lot of upkeep. And that was one major thing about Incan civilization, is that they have to get the amount of labor to work on the road to maintain it, along with other infrastructure like irrigation and farmland and whatnot. So that's one big thing that they need to do, is just find the labor, and they do that by having their subjected peoples pay taxes, not with money, but through communal labor, which follows a lot of the kind of former Andean civilizations. So this idea of work as payment keeps up the road network, it keeps up the highly organized government systems. And a lot of these roads still exist today. There's at least fragments of it that still exist today. So even in Western South America today, if you go to different regions, you can still walk on an Incan road, which is a pretty amazing thing, because that's over 500 years ago. All right. Again, the Inca were obsessively organized. They wanted to organize every single thing that they could possibly think of, really. So their empire is divided into 4 different regions, 80 provinces, 160 districts. So that shows, again, their obsessive organization. It had different levels of nobles and landowners in different areas, and different political elites would run different areas. So it was all very well planned out. One of the most extraordinary examples of their organization is a religious system that largely they inherited the beginnings of it, because a lot of former Andean civilizations were into mummification of their dead, and especially of their political leaders, and worshiping the mummies of their political leaders, and hoping to get like advice from the mummies or something like that during ceremonies. And an Incan emperor named Pachacuti from 1438 to 71 developed an even more organized religious structure that revolved around the emperor himself, basically the king. So he comes up with this updated system of ancestor worship that really heavily altered the Incan culture in a whole lot of ways. So his system was that he was king, and that his eldest son would inherit his political position. His eldest son would become the next emperor, basically. And that became normalized in Incan culture, in Incan politics. But the eldest son would only inherit the throne, not the family wealth. So the younger sons who do inherit the wealth, their job is to use that wealth to build a religious shrine to mummify their father, his dead body, and to develop basically a popular kind of religious cult around the mummy and the kind of personality of the father. And the idea was that it's their responsibility to worship the mummy as if the guy was still alive. And that becomes extremely expensive because you have to have a building to do it. You have to have candles and resources around in the building to do it, and you have to have full-time employees to continue the ceremonies on a daily and weekly basis. So that requires a massive amount of money. So that requirement will motivate future Incan leaders to conquer more land, to gain more wealth for their family, so that that wealth can be used to build a shrine for the worship cult of the king who has done the conquering. So it's like, if I'm the emperor, I want to go out and get more land in order to build up the wealth in my family and the resources to build a shrine so that when I die, my body will be mummified and held in the shrine, and those ceremonies for my mummy can continue. So that's a kind of economic motivation for the emperors to constantly be looking for more places to conquer, more land to get, more resources. And the Incan religion in general is built really around one central god that the Incans believe would manifest in three different ways. First, as like the creator of all life and the whole universe. Also could manifest as the sun itself, the kind of giver of life and kind of giver of sunshine to the crops that the food grow. And also the god that controls thunder and the weather patterns that help the crops grow. So it is believed that one central god controls all those things, but kind of interacts in the world in those different ways according to like these different images and kind of different physical beings that the god would kind of inhabit to do those things in the world. So it's really based around this one god. The Spanish conquerors who would show up and eventually conquer the Incan Empire heavily misinterpreted that. The Spanish would think that the Inca worshipped three separate gods, and that the Inca just over time kind of elevated the sun god to be more important and more of a focus than the other two. But that was completely wrong. The Incans saw it as three different versions of the same god. The Inca were also willing to assimilate religious ideas from the cultures that they conquered. So they would even take idols of the gods that the conquered people, the people they just conquered, worshipped, and they would take those idols and bring them into their most important temples, especially the temples to Inti, the sun god, or the sun manifestation, to show that those newly conquered people were equal and important within the Incan Empire. And again, the Inca used not money so much as we would think of it, but they paid fees and taxes in labor obligations that the Incan called mita, M-I-T''A. So those are the kind of personal obligations that you have to the community and the government to work for a certain amount of days or weeks, building the roads or keeping up the terrace farms that you see here in this picture. I like this picture also because it shows how heavily you see in the background the landscape is just on the side of a mountain, so it's virtually straight downhill, and that in the foreground you see that the Inca figured out how to use that kind of land and to kind of flatten it in little pieces so that they could have farms or grow crops or make temples or houses or whatever they're trying to do on the side of a mountain, which is extremely impressive. So again, the Incan government is extremely obsessed with organization, and that shows in the kind of terrorist structures we're seeing. the Incan government basically tried to run the farmlands as much as they possibly could. So it's said that the Incan government controlled all farming surpluses. So the Inca controlled the food supply to a large extent. So even if you owned your own land in the Incan Empire, you would grow the food to feed your own family, and any leftover, any surplus food would go to the government. They had to develop, obviously, some type of mountainside terracing, largely for farming, because if you just run water down the side of a mountain, it's all going to run off down toward the bottom. So that's probably one major reason that they created these terrace farms on the side of the mountain, to flatten them out so that the water could get to the crops without running down. And it's, again, extremely impressive that they could do something like this. It's a real economic genius to try to figure out how to bring that type of land under cultivation, under control, in order to feed the population. And the Incan government would often have large groups of laborers, workers, as kind of colonists, that it would send these expert farmers to newly conquered areas to try to figure out the best way of farming those newly conquered areas to increase and ensure an adequate food production, and to get that surplus to the government. And the government would use that surplus to buy resources and whatnot, but largely to help its own population in case of a natural disaster, like a flood or some hurricane maybe, or something like this. The Incas, their kind of cultural achievements, the buildings that they built, the religious ideas, the roads, their cultural products, largely seem to be a result of the ideas and the cultures from the civilizations that existed before them in the same area. So the Incan kind of cultural artifacts that we have are largely holdovers from the Shaman civilization or Tawana Coup or someone like that. It doesn't seem that the Inca had a very big kind of cultural industry to manufacture their own new cultural ideas. And historians and archaeologists estimate that there are somewhere around 1 million people living in the Incan Empire by the time the Spanish start to show up in the early 1500s. So the Inca are really at the height of their power when the Spanish conquerors come to the area. And we'll stop here for today, and we'll talk later about what happens when the Spanish come into the Incan Empire, and how the Spanish basically conquer the Incan Empire. But that's for another day, and we'll stop here for today.